The last turn onto Nathan's Street always made me ease off the gas a little, like some part of me still hoped he'd greet me the way he used to. But the moment I stepped through his door, that hope died quick. "Just leave it there. It's nothing." His voice cut across the room, flat and dismissive, like I wasn't even standing there. I followed his gesture. The gift I brought, just a $25 folding knife, lay tipped against the trash bin, half buried under torn wrapping paper. The overhead light caught a deep crease in the cardboard, the kind of bend something gets when it's been stepped on without a second thought. Everyone kept laughing, carrying on like nothing had happened. And I stood there, holding the box of pastries I'd picked up on the way, feeling less like a father and more like someone who'd wandered into a house that didn't recognize him anymore. No one looked down. No one picked it up. Not even him. Right then, something quiet but sharp settled in my chest. I wouldn't let that small act of disregard become the final version of me in their story. The last turn onto Nathan's Street always felt a little too smooth, as if the road had been built for someone else's life. Rows of trimmed hedges, porch lights glowing like stage lamps, wreaths hung with perfect symmetry. I eased my truck along the curb until the familiar two-story house came into view. Warm light spilled from the windows, soft and golden, the kind that makes a place look kinder than it really is. On the passenger seat sat the small cardboard box with the pocket knife inside. $25, the same model I carried through blizzards and wildfires and long summer hikes with Nathan running at my heels. That boy once begged me to teach him how to whittle. He carried his first knife like a badge of honor. Tonight I was not sure he even remembered that version of himself. I shut the engine off and let the silence fill the cab. The heater ticked as it cooled. My breath fogged the windshield in a thin patch of white. I tucked the box inside my coat and stepped out into the December cold. It bit across my cheeks in that familiar way, almost welcome after the warmth of the truck. Before I reached the door, it opened. Alyssa stood there, all soft colors and measured smiles, her voice hovering between politeness and impatience. "There you are," she said. "We hoped the drive wasn't too rough." I stepped inside and let her take my coat. The air smelled like scented candles and marinara, not a trace of the old pine and wood smoke I was used to. Nathan's house had become the kind of place where everything matched. Coordinated cushions framed quotes on the wall, a tree decorated like a showroom display. None of it carried fingerprints of a boy who once tracked mud across my floors after chasing grasshoppers behind the ranger station. Nathan stood near the island, beer in hand, laughing with Marjorie. When he saw me, his smile flickered, then settled into something practiced. "Glad you made it, Dad." I handed him the box. He opened it without ceremony, lifted the pocket knife, turned it once under the kitchen lights. For a moment I caught a flash of the boy who used to light up at the sight of anything sharp or rugged or outdoorsy. Then it vanished. "Nice," he said. "Classic." He set it on the counter beside a stack of paper plates. It slipped under a napkin when someone brushed past. The knife went quiet, and still half hidden. Easy to forget. Easy to throw out with the rest of the party trash. Marjorie stepped forward with a velvet box of her own. Nathan opened it, and the watch inside caught the light like a small sun. Stainless steel polished links, a face packed with dials no one really uses. People gathered around him with little sounds of admiration. He lifted his wrist and admired the weight of it. I had seen men do that with new chainsaws, turning them under the sun to admire the teeth of the blade. Same gesture, different world. The conversation kept rolling. Football murmured from the muted TV. Plates clattered in the sink. Alyssa's friends floated through the rooms in coordinated holiday sweaters. I found myself at the edge of it all, where men like me usually stand. Near the doorway, out of the way, hands tucked into the pockets of a jacket, no longer on my shoulders. Nathan wandered to a cluster of people and began telling some story about his childhood. He said it lightly with a grin. My dad used to drag me camping in every kind of weather. People laughed. Someone said that sounded rough. He shrugged in that way adults shrug when they talk about things that shaped them without realizing it. For 1 second, I saw him as he had been at 8 years old, running toward me after I returned from a long shift, Boots' still muddy radio buzzing at my hip. He used to leap into my arms the moment I walked through the door. Tonight, he barely touched my shoulder. I drifted to the hallway where the noise softened. The tree lights blinked in perfect rhythm. No homemade ornaments, no crooked star, only things purchased to match a color scheme. I wondered if Nathan had kept any of the things we made together. The carved whistle, the little wooden birdhouse, the snow globe we bought on a road trip through Montana. I doubted it. Alyssa walked past carrying wine glasses. She spoke quietly as she passed the archway into the living room. Her voice floated just far enough for me to hear. "He means well, Mom. He tries. But he doesn't really fit into our plans." Plans. A strange word to hear your life measured against. Marjorie answered with a sigh. "Just keep the paperwork clean, honey. Sentiment complicates everything." The words were small blades sharp, where no one could see. I stood very still until the sounds of the house swallowed them. Eventually the crowd thinned. Families left with leftover dessert wrapped in foil. Someone scraped frosting off a plate with a fork. The football game ended, and no one noticed. Nathan handed me my coat with a tired smile. "Thanks for coming," he said. "It means a lot." I nodded and slipped my arms into the sleeves. A corner of the counter caught my eye. A small pile of mail waited there. Flyers, bills, envelopes with windows. One of them had my name printed in neat black letters under their address. The bank logo sat in the corner, familiar and unwelcome. I picked it up. "Looks like you got some of my mail," I said. "Oh, that." Nathan waved a hand. "Alyssa handled most of that stuff. We're doing a refinance, just the usual adulting. Don't worry about it. We got it covered." The word "covered" sat heavy between us. I slid the letter back onto the pile. Outside, the cold had deepened. My footsteps crunched lightly on the sidewalk. Through their front window I could see Nathan laughing again, the new watch catching the room's light. On the far end of the sofa, the knife box lay half buried under a throw pillow. I sat in my truck for a long moment before turning the key. The cab filled with the smell of old coffee and pine dust. Familiar things. Things that did not need approval or compliments or curated lighting. As I pulled away, their house shrank in the rearview mirror. Warm light, perfect tree, quiet laughter. All of it slipping into the dark behind me. The road ahead looked longer than usual, as if the night itself had stretched. Halfway home, I realized something had shifted. Not loud, not obvious, but unmistakable. Like a tremor you only feel through the soles of your boots. The kind that warns you the ground has changed shape, and nothing will be quite the same after this. I drove on, letting the silence settle, knowing it was not peace I felt, but the beginning of something else. Something I could not yet name. The morning settled into my house like a slow breath. Pale winter light seeped through the kitchen window, soft enough to make everything look older than it really was. I stood by the table for a moment, before sitting down, the chair creaking under me the same way it had creaked for years. The envelope from last night lay where I had left it, a thin white shape against the wood, waiting for my hands. I opened it with the same care I used to give to trail maps after a storm, smoothing the pages flat, reading in quiet. Numbers lined themselves up in ways I did not like. Words like revised terms and evaluation and pending review stared back at me. My name appeared in places where I knew I had never agreed to be tucked between legal blocks of text that looked harmless if you did not know how these things worked. I knew enough. I reached for my phone. The call rang twice before Nathan answered. His voice was rough with sleep. "Hey, Dad." I looked at the papers again, at the signature line without my signature. "There is a refinance application here, with my name on it." He exhaled, like I had stepped into the middle of something he did not want to explain. "Right. Yeah. They must have sent that to you. We are just adjusting the rate and locking in a better term. You did not mention it," I said. "Dad, he said I have got it handled. Everything is under control. You do not need to worry about this." Silence settled between us. I listened for a crack in his voice, anything that sounded like hesitation, but what I heard was distance clean and practiced. "When there are papers with my name on them, I said I like to be in the loop." He gave a short laugh that was not quite a laugh. "Trust me on this. Please, do not make it complicated." The words echoed softly against the inside of my skull, as if something in me had knocked against them from the other side. I let the pause stretch, then let it go. "We can talk another time," I said. "Yeah, sure. Later." The call ended, and the room folded back into quiet. I closed the envelope and pushed it a few inches across the table, not far enough to put it away, not close enough to face it again. I made coffee and drove into town. The roads were clear, the kind of dull winter clear that leaves everything gray and predictable. The convenience store bell chimed its usual tired tune when I stepped inside. The place smelled like old espresso fuel and a hint of last night's fried chicken. Ray stood near the coolers reading labels like the milk might confess something if he stared hard enough. He nodded when he saw me. "Morning, Graham." "Morning." He shifted the milk to his other hand and studied my face for a second. "Heard your boy is getting the house ready," he said. "Word around is you might be moving in soon. Said he wants you somewhere safer." I let the words settle. They did not sting as much as they surprised me. "That what he said?" Ray scratched his jaw. "Something along those lines. Folks got the impression things are getting tougher for you up at your place. That it might be time for adjustments." Adjustments. Another word in a growing list of words I had never said but somehow belonged to me. "I am managing fine," I said. Ray nodded like he believed me, which helped a little. "Well, if you ever need help winterizing that cabin again, you know where to find me." We parted ways at the register. I walked back into the cold with a hot coffee and a mind going places I did not want it to go. A plow scraped across the highway, sending sparks off the asphalt as it caught the edge of a manhole cover. The sound rolled across the air like metal dragging on memory. Back home, I set the coffee on the counter and opened my phone. I told myself I was only checking the weather. Instead, I found myself scrolling through Nathan and Alyssa's posts again. One photo showed the two of them painting a spare room. The caption said, "Building space for new things and making room for necessary transitions." Comments from friends said they were sweet to take on the responsibility of supporting aging parents. Someone had left a heart, and the words, "You two are doing the right thing." Another post was a family selfie on their couch. The caption mentioned juggling a busy season and stepping up when others can no longer hold everything on their own. That line sat under the photo like a quiet accusation dressed as gratitude. I stared at the screen. The edges of the phone felt sharper than usual. These were small sentences, small suggestions, but they added up to a story I did not recognize. I put the phone face down and walked out to the garage. The wooden door groaned as I lifted it, a familiar complaint from years of weather. I stepped inside and pulled the cord for the overhead light. The bulb flickered before settling into a steady hum. The radio sat on the shelf, waiting. I turned the dial until a country song floated through the static. Low guitar, slow rhythm, a man singing about keeping too much inside until the weight changes the shape of your life. I knew the feeling. I sat on the stool by the workbench. Dust floated through the beam of the bulb, drifting like it had all the time in the world. I picked up a wrench, then set it back down without using it. My hands rested on my knees, fingers tapping once, then stilling. For a moment, I pictured Nathan as a boy again, standing beside me while I sharpened tools. He used to ask what each one was for. I would tell him, and he would nod, like he was memorizing the whole world. Somewhere along the way, that boy had drifted into a man who now talked about me as if I were fading. The thought settled in my chest, heavy enough to press against the back of my ribs. Outside, the wind pushed at the siding, a long, slow pressure that reminded me of the way snow leans on the branches of old pines. Steady, deliberate, patient. That kind of pressure changes things if you ignore it long enough. I turned the radio down, then off. The quiet that followed felt different from the quiet in the house. This one had texture, a thickness that made the air feel cooler. When I closed the garage door, the last sliver of light from outside cut across the concrete floor before disappearing. I walked back into the house with a sense that something inside me had shifted, even if I could not say what. In the kitchen, the envelope still sat on the table. A single beam of late afternoon light had found it through the window, turning the white paper into a small, bright shape against the wood. I stood beside it, the room silent except for the clock ticking in the background. I rested my hand on the edge of the envelope just long enough to feel the grain of the paper under my fingertips. It felt like the first touch of a door that might need to be opened whether I wanted to or not. The house settled into its own darkness as evening pressed against the windows. I stood by the table for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the room and the silence that came with it. The envelope still lay on the wood, pale against the deepening shadows. I picked up my keys, slid them into my pocket, and stepped outside. The cold evening air met me with a sharpness that felt almost deliberate. Nathan's jacket was still in the back seat of my truck. I lifted it, shook off a few stray pine needles, and set it beside me. A simple errand, I told myself. Return the jacket, exchange a few polite words. Keep the peace. But something in my chest was still tight from everything I had tried not to think about since the day before. Their house was lit when I pulled up. Warm light behind curtains, the kind that usually meant dinner or a quiet night in. I walked up the steps with the jacket in hand, my boots thudding lightly against the wooden boards. Before I could knock, a voice drifted through the door. It wasn't loud, not enough to be careless, but just enough to carry through the thin space between the frame and the cold air. I heard only fragments at first, words like paperwork and evaluation and refinance. Then a softer tone, Alyssa's voice, low, but edged with certainty. If the report shows instability, the bank won't need his approval. The last word seemed to linger, as if the cold had caught it before it could fade. Instability. It slid into place with everything else I had been hearing lately. Confused, forgetful, needing help. A picture being painted stroke by stroke, none of it drawn by me. I stepped back from the door. A small sound inside made me pause. Nathan's voice quieter than hers, carrying something I had not heard in a long time. Uncertainty. "I do not know, Alyssa. Maybe we should—" Her reply cut him off before the thought could land. "It is the only way, trust me. We are doing the right thing." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind families share. A careful silence, like someone pressing down on fragile glass to test how much pressure it could take before cracking. I placed the jacket on the porch bench. My fingers lingered on the fabric for a moment. It was still warm from the truck. The walk back to my truck felt longer than it should have. The driveway glistened faintly under the porch light, and the cold bit deeper, as if it wanted me to stay aware. I sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. Their voices still clung to me, broken pieces of a conversation I was never meant to hear. The truck rumbled to life. I drove toward town, letting the road unwind beneath me. The market glowed softly under a faded yellow sign when I pulled in. I didn't need anything, but the silence in the cab felt too thick, too full of questions without places to go. Inside, the aisles were mostly empty. A radio near the counter played an old song about mistakes men make when they stay quiet too long. I walked toward the coolers, scanning for Ray's familiar stance. He found me first. "Evening, Graham." "Evening." He watched me with that steady, careful look people get when they've been holding on to something they think you should know. "Saw your son earlier," he said. "Stopped by the pharmacy, mentioned you have been mixing things up. Forgetting details. He was asking about supplements for memory." My hand tightened on the handle of the basket. "Only for a moment." "Did he?" Ray shifted his weight and nodded. "He said he is worried. Folks have been talking. Nothing bad. You know how people fill in blanks." I did not reply. The air in the store seemed to thin around me. Words had weight, especially in a small town. Once they started rolling, they picked up speed on their own. I left the basket at the end of the aisle and walked out with only the sound of the bell behind me. The cold evening swallowed me whole as I stepped outside. My breath rose in steady clouds, each one dissolving before the next. I leaned against the truck door for a moment, letting the cold settle into my skin, hoping it would quiet the noise inside my head. Back home, the house felt different. Not unfamiliar, just heavier. I moved through the rooms without turning on many lights. The shadows made everything look older, but in a way that felt honest. I stood by the counter and dialed the bank. The hold music clicked on a thin melody stretched too far. When the representative returned, her voice was smooth, efficient. She asked for my information. I gave it. Then came the pause, brief, but long enough for my stomach to drop a little. "We received your updated psychological evaluation today," she said. "It suggests potential concerns regarding cognitive reliability. This may affect your co-signer status." I swallowed once. "Who submitted it?" There was a soft shuffle of papers. "It was filed on your behalf by a third party. The name on the form appears to be a physician." "Not my physician." She hesitated. "If you believe the document is inaccurate, you can dispute it through your primary provider." I thanked her and ended the call. The quiet that followed was thick enough to breathe in. I stepped outside again. The night sky had cleared stars, scattered across the dark like embers that refused to die out. A truck passed on the distant highway headlights, sweeping briefly across the tree line. The branches moved with the wind, slow and deliberate. Someone was rewriting the truth piece by piece. Someone with influence. Someone who thought I would not see it coming. And somewhere in the center of it, my son stood too close to the fire, whether he realized it or not. The next day, I saw Marjorie at the market. She walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. She glanced at me only long enough to not greet me. a soft, practiced avoidance like she had already made up her mind about the kind of man I was. I didn't speak to her. There was no point in speaking to someone who had already chosen their version of the truth. Back home, my keys landed lightly on the table. The envelope sat exactly where I had left it, still catching the last bit of daylight. The paper glowed faintly, as if holding something beneath the surface. I touched the corner with one finger. The texture of the paper was cool, almost smooth enough to pretend nothing had changed. But something had. It was quiet, like the first shift of wind in a forest before the smoke becomes visible. The kind of quiet that tells you everything is already moving even if you cannot see it yet. I stood there a long time, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Evening light slipped away, leaving only the dark and the thin outline of the envelope beneath my hand. Whatever story they were trying to write, I knew one thing, as the room finally settled into night. It would not end the way they imagined. I sat alone in the truck a moment longer than I needed, both hands on the wheel, feeling the cold through the glass. The day had the color of worn steel, the kind that promises nothing but a long road ahead. I steadied my breath, then drove toward the small law office near the old train depot, the same road I had taken 1,000 times during my ranger years. Back then, silence meant focus. Now it meant something heavier. Connor Reyes greeted me in the lobby, a quiet nod, a firm grip, the kind of handshake young men give when they want to show they take you seriously. He carried my folder under his arm and led me to a narrow room with a single window that looked out over the tracks. The light was thin winter light, almost metallic. He set the folder on the desk, opened it, and studied the forged report again. His brow tightened as he checked signatures and dates. He didn't say anything for a long minute. Then he looked up at me the way a mechanic looks under a hood before telling you someone tampered with the wiring. Someone faked this, Mr. Holt, and not very well. His voice was low, careful. He didn't hurry. He wanted me to hear the weight of it. I didn't answer right away. I watched him close the file, open it again, check the margins, the header, the odd spacing. Years on the fire line taught me to judge a man not by his words, but by what he does when he thinks no one is watching. Connor examined every inch of that document. The quiet in the room felt honest. He sat back, tapping the corner of the page with one finger, as if measuring the damage. When he finally spoke again, his tone was steady, grounded. The real hospital records show full competence. This forged version wouldn't hold up to any proper review. If you dispute the refinance, the bank is required to freeze the application until a fraud investigation is complete. I let the words settle. It wasn't victory. It was a map. Before leaving, I looked at him a little longer. Trust doesn't come easy at my age. He held my gaze without flinching a small thing, but enough for now. At home, the wind was pushing the loose boards along the porch, tapping them like an old clock. I hung my coat by the door and crossed the living room to the cedar box sitting under the window. I built that box when Nathan was 10, carved his initials in the bottom corner, sanded the lid smooth until the grain shone copper in the sun. Funny how a man remembers the work his boy never sees. I opened the box and breathed in the faint scent of cedar and old paper. Inside were the documents I had kept for decades. Most people throw things away. I never did after losing an insurance claim back in my 20s. Paper had saved me once. I meant for it to save me again. I took out the original mortgage, then the co-sign agreement, then the bank letter from the year Nathan lost his job, and I quietly covered 3 months of payments. Each page carried a story he no longer remembered, sacrifices I made without asking for thanks. I lined them on the kitchen table and studied them the way I used to study fire maps, searching for shifts in wind and places where the burn might jump. Outside, the last of the afternoon was draining from the sky, leaving only a pale blue trace above the rooftops. I could hear a distant dog barking, the kind of lonely sound that travels farther in cold air. I brewed a cup of coffee, even though it was too late in the day for it. The kitchen light glowed soft against the walls, warming the edges of the scene. I pulled up Alyssa's social media on my phone. She had posted about upgrading the house, soon proud of their plans, certain everything would go through. A little line at the bottom caught my eye. New era soon. No more loose ends. I set the phone face down on the table and let my hand rest on the folder of real documents. They thought I was a loose end. They thought age made a man easy to move aside. I had heard people make that mistake before on mountainsides, where one wrong assumption could cost lives. The heater clicked on, the room filled with a low hum that made the papers flutter gently at the corners. I gathered everything into one neat stack, pressing the edges until they aligned. Order always calmed me. It reminded me of choosing control over anger. There was no triumph in what I held. Only the truth. Clean, steady, unshaken. I closed the cedar box with a quiet thud, then turned off the kitchen light. The house fell into a soft dark, the kind of dark that lets you hear your own breath. I stood there a long moment, my hand still on the lid, feeling the grain under my palm, remembering the boy who once carved his initials into it, and the man he had become. Outside, a thin wind touched the windows almost like a whisper. I stayed still, listening to it, letting the silence settle into my bones. Some battles start loud, others begin with nothing but a closed box, a cold wind, and the slow understanding that the time to move has come. And in that quiet, I felt the next step take shape. Rain had started before dawn, a steady whisper on the roof that softened the edges of everything inside my garage. I stood near the old workbench and let the dim light settle around me. It felt like the kind of morning that asked a man to be honest, even when honesty stung. The air carried that damp winter smell of wet cedar and metal, the kind that clings to your clothes long after you step outside. I pulled down the plastic bin where I kept pieces of Nathan's childhood. The lid scraped softly as I set it on the concrete floor. Inside were the small things that once held entire worlds for him. His camping badges frayed at the corners, the broken compass he swore he would fix. A wooden whistle he carved with me one summer afternoon when mosquitoes hummed around us and time felt wide open. I held the compass in my palm. The needle twitched slightly, still trying to find north. I let out a long breath. Maybe we were the same, that compass, and I both pointing in the right direction once, now tugged off course by years of weather and silence. A memory rose without permission, the night of his middle school drum performance. I can still see the faint glow of the dashboard as I tried to drive through the blizzard radio crackling with warnings. A family had been trapped off the trail, and I chose duty like I always did. By the time I reached the auditorium, the lights were off, and the janitor was stacking chairs. Nathan stood near the stage with his drumsticks tucked under one arm, his eyes holding nothing sharp or loud, just a quiet I could never quite decipher. I told him I tried. He nodded once and said he knew. But a space opened between us that night, thin as air at first, then colder as the years pressed on. I set the compass on the workbench and listened to the rain shift to a gentler rhythm. That old tin roof has a way of offering you truths you don't want to name. The truth was simple. I taught my son how to build a fire, how to track a trail, how to carry weight without complaint. But I never taught him how to read me, and maybe he learned distance by watching me keep my own walls high. A long moment passed before I picked up my jacket and drove into town. The streets were glossy with rain, the kind of shine that makes every stoplight look softer. I pulled into the library parking lot, wiped the fog from the windshield, and headed inside. Laura was shelving new arrivals near the front desk. She looked up with a small smile that carried years in it, both good and hard. She stepped closer when she saw my face. "You look tired," she said quietly. "Long week," I answered. She waited for more. She always had a way of waiting without pressure. I told her about the forged documents, about the refinance, about the lies floating around town like leaves in the wind. Her hand stilled on the book she was holding. She exhaled slowly, not surprised, just saddened. "You didn't do anything to deserve this," she said. "But you know Nathan. He fills blanks when he doesn't understand something." Silence gives him room to imagine the worst. I leaned on the counter, the wood warm under my palm. "Maybe I taught him that," I said. "Maybe he learned to assume, because I never explained." Laura shook her head slightly. "You did what you thought was right. But sometimes he needed the version of you that wasn't out saving someone else." Her words didn't accuse. They simply laid the truth down in front of me. I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle. I cared, but caring isn't the same as being present. And absence has a way of echoing long after you think the moment has passed. Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle. I walked to the truck and sat for a while, listening to the soft thump of water dripping from the branches above. I reached over to the passenger seat where I kept the original mortgage paperwork, the co-sign agreement, the statements I paid during the years Nathan was trying to find his footing. My hand brushed the file, and something steadied in my chest. All those sacrifices had been quiet, even invisible. But they were real, and they mattered more than any story being spun now. I drove home slowly, letting the sky lighten with every mile. The garage welcomed me with its familiar cold. I placed the wooden whistle next to the compass, both objects catching a faint line of light through the small window. The whistle reminded me of a summer long gone when Nathan still looked to me for permission to explore the world. The compass, even broken, still tried to find north. Together, they carried more truth than any forged document ever could. I sat on the old stool and let my thoughts settle. There was guilt in me, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. I could own my part without letting theirs vanish into smoke. And if silence once created shadows, I knew it could also bring clarity if used differently this time. Not to hide, not to withdraw, but to choose the moment when truth would matter most. The rain softened until it was barely a murmur on the roof. A pale warmth began to push through the clouds, brushing the floor in thin strokes of morning. I rested my hand over the compass and felt the metal cool against my skin. The needle didn't move. Still, something inside me aligned just a little. The day ahead felt heavier than most, but not in a way that bent me. More like a weight I was ready to lift. I sat there in the quiet hours, letting the room breathe with me, waiting for the light to fully settle before I stood up. Nothing dramatic happened. No revelation, no burst of resolve. Just a steady sense that the distance between who I had been and who I needed to be was finally narrowing. Outside, a single drop slid down the window pane, catching the new light. I watched it fall slow and deliberate until it reached the sill and disappeared into the quiet morning. The night settled heavy around the house, The kind of quiet that feels almost aware of you, and I let it follow me into the next morning. The air was cold and thin when I stepped outside. Frost clung to the truck windows, catching the early light in a way that reminded me of the long hours waiting on fire lines, listening for wind shifts. Silence sharpens a man if he lets it. That morning, it felt like the only thing holding me steady. Connor's office sat in a brick building near the courthouse, the kind of place where decisions tend to echo long after they're spoken. I arrived early, brewed coffee from the machine in the corner, and watched the steam rise off the lid. My hands were steady. They hadn't always been these past weeks, but today they were. Nathan walked in first. His eyes flicked toward me, then away, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to meet mine. Alyssa followed, stiff in her coat jaw, tight enough to creak. Marjorie entered last, carrying that same quiet superiority she wore at the market, the kind of look that treated me like a man already fading. Connor greeted them and motioned to the table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He simply set two documents down side by side. The edges aligned perfectly, though nothing else in those papers did. He tapped the first one, the real hospital assessment, then the forged one. Font mismatched, dates off signature clipped from a different form. Even the paper stock was wrong. The room didn't go loud. It went silent in a way that tightened the air. Alyssa's breath hitched before she caught herself. Marjorie shifted back, face stiffening into something unreadable. Nathan stared at the documents, then at his hands, then at the floor, as though each glance weighed more than he expected. Connor spoke with the calm precision lawyers sharpen through years of discipline. He explained the legal implications, the fraud, the protections for co-signers, the penalties for forging medical evaluations. He never raised his tone. He didn't need to. The truth was louder than any of us. When he finished, the room stayed still. I could feel the heat of the coffee cup fading beside me. I turned toward Nathan first. I wanted to see him fully. Not as my son in trouble. Not as the boy with dirt on his jeans and a grin too wide for his face. Just as the man he had grown into, choices and all. I said it low steady, the way you tell a truth you've carried too long. If you wanted me off the refinance, you could have asked. He lifted his gaze, a flicker of something sharp crossing his face. Shame, maybe, or fear, or the realization that he had let something get out of hand long before he understood the cost. Alyssa spoke, voice tight. She tried to explain, redirect, say it wasn't meant to go this far, but the words landed weak, thin as frost on a window. Marjorie stepped in next, chin lifted, trying to angle the conversation toward misunderstanding or clerical error. Connor cut in professional and firm, reminding them that fraud doesn't grow out of clerical errors. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue. Connor laid out the objection forms. The ink glinted under the office lights, a quiet invitation to restore the truth. When I picked up the pen, it felt heavier than it should. I held it for a moment, long enough to hope Nathan might say something. A word. A breath. Some signal that he understood why this mattered. He didn't. So I signed. One stroke at a time, each letter an anchor setting itself back where it belonged. The papers slid back across the table. As I set the pen down, my hand stayed still afterward, resting lightly on the wood, the way I used to rest it on the hood of my truck before heading into a hard trail. A small pause before the next step. No one spoke. Connor quietly organized the files. Alyssa stared at the table. Marjorie folded her hands like she was praying for the moment to pass faster than it could. Nathan finally looked at me, eyes red at the edges, as if something inside him had cracked just enough for light to slip through. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His breath shook. Whatever words he found, he kept them. And maybe that silence was the truest thing between us in that room. I stood first. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. Nathan flinched at the sound. I reached for my keys, feeling the cool metal press into my palm, the same set I'd carried for years. I caught a reflection of myself in the office window, layered against the pale morning outside. Older, maybe, but not small. Not diminished. Just a man standing back up. As I walked out the corridor, light washed over me. Behind the closed door, voices rose muffled, shaken, but none of them followed. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting. A thin sheet of frost had formed on the hood of my truck, catching the early sun in scattered shards. I brushed a hand across it, watching the crystals break and scatter like breath in winter air. The engine rumbled awake, steady and familiar. I sat with it idling a moment longer, letting the quiet settle. The steering wheel felt warm under my hands, as if the truck itself remembered every mile we had pushed through together. Truth rarely shouts. It just stands there waiting, and when the moment comes, it doesn't hesitate. I backed out of the lot, slowly, the morning light stretching across the asphalt. The world felt colder, but clearer, like someone had wiped a smudge off a long-neglected window. Whatever came next, I knew the reckoning had only just begun. The house was quiet after Nathan and the others drove away, the kitchen light pooling across the counter like a thin sheet of dusk. I stood there for a long time, with my hands resting on the cool surface, listening to the soft ticking of the clock above the pantry door. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, and the kind of silence that comes only after a hard truth hovered in the room. I felt the weight of it settle across my shoulders, the way wet canvas settles after a long hike. Heavy, but familiar. I brewed a pot of coffee, letting the smell anchor me. By the time the steam curled up from the mug, the night had deepened, and the storm clouds pressed low over the pines behind my house. I took the cup to the window and watched the streetlights flicker under the rain. Somewhere in that darkness, the consequences of the day were already shifting pieces of my family in ways I could not yet see. When the knock came, it was soft, almost apologetic. I set the mug aside and opened the door. Nathan stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe, rain dripping from his hair onto the collar of his jacket. In his arms, little Evan clung to him half asleep, his cheek pressed to Nathan's shoulder. The boy's small fingers curled around the fabric, trusting his father without question. Nathan's voice trembled when he spoke, barely more than a breath. "Dad, I didn't know where else to go." I stepped aside. The warmth of the house closed around them as they entered. Evan blinked up at the lights, dazed and quiet, the way children get after a long, confusing night. I took his jacket, shook the rain from it, and laid it across a chair to dry. Nathan stood in the middle of the kitchen, shoulders caved inward like a man who had been carrying a burden too long and finally lost the strength to keep it hidden. The storm had soaked through his clothes, but something else weighed heavier than the water. I poured 2 mugs of coffee. He wrapped his hands around one, not drinking, just holding it. Evan had fallen asleep on the couch by then, curled into the blanket I kept for cold mornings. Nathan looked at the steam rising from his mug. "Dad, I messed this up." His voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. "I should have stopped it." I let the silence stretch. It wasn't the kind meant to punish. It was the kind that gives room for truth. When he finally lifted his eyes to mine, they were red around the edges, swollen from more than the rain. They held fear, regret, and something I hadn't seen in him since he was a boy, trying to explain a broken window. Shame mixed with longing for reassurance he wasn't sure he deserved. I said, being a man isn't about never failing. It's about not hiding from the truth when you do. His shoulders shook as he exhaled. He looked at his hands as if the answers were locked in the lines of his palms. Then the words came halting at first, then spilling forward with a weight that had clearly been building for years. He spoke of the pressure Alyssa and Marjorie had put on him, the promises they made about a bigger house, a better neighborhood, a future where appearances mattered more than honesty. He confessed how resentment had crept into him, quiet and steady, every time someone praised my years of service. He said he felt like he could never measure up, not as a father, not as a man. He admitted he let that feeling drive him into choices he never would have made on his own. As he talked, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not relief. A kind of aching clarity. The kind that comes when you finally see what years of distance have carved in someone you love. I told him I had made mistakes, too. I told him I missed concerts, birthdays, and school nights because I thought protecting strangers from wildfire was enough to prove I was a good father. I told him I knew now that children measure love differently than adults do. They count presence more than sacrifice. He listened without interrupting, eyes lowered the way a man listens, when every word is both a comfort and a cut. The storm grew louder beyond the windows, wind brushing against the siding. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. Nathan looked toward the sound as if expecting it to carry an answer. After a while, Evan stirred on the couch and murmured something in his sleep. Nathan's gaze softened. He said, I don't want him to grow up thinking I'm the kind of man who hides behind lies. I nodded. Then we both sat quietly, letting the sound of the storm fill the space where anger might have lived. When morning edged toward the horizon, a pale gray light slipped through the blinds. I made a call to Connor. My voice was steady, not protective enough to erase consequences, but clear enough to guide what came next. I told him I wanted options that secured the house for Evan without erasing accountability for the adults who had created this chaos. He said he would draw up a modified plan and get back to me within the day. Nathan sat across from me with a level of exhaustion that came not from weather, but from truth. I said, you'll face what comes, and I'll stand where I should stand, not in front of you, beside you, for Evan. His eyes glistened, not with relief, but with understanding. A slow nod, a quiet thank you that barely made it past his throat. As they left, the rain had eased to a fine mist. Evan's small hand clung to Nathan's as they walked down the steps. Just before he reached the truck, Nathan turned back. His expression held a promise without words, a vow carved from humility instead of pride. When the engine started, the taillights glowed through the morning fog like two dim embers fighting their way back to warmth. I watched until they turned the corner and disappeared behind the trees. Inside, the kitchen felt still. The second mug of coffee sat on the counter, half empty, the warmth fading. I placed my palm over it, letting the last trace of heat settle into my skin, and for a brief moment I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the quiet beginning of it. The clock ticked once, sharp and clear in the soft light of morning. Then the room fell into a silence that carried both the cost and the hope of honor. The soft click of the clock still echoed faintly as I stepped out to the porch, the morning air pale and cool against my face. The light was thin, almost shy, as if the day itself understood that the house behind me had finally quieted after months of storms. I stood there for a moment, letting the calm settle into my chest, steady and slow. The neighborhood was still. A dog barked somewhere down the block, the sound carried gently by the winter breeze. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup of coffee and let the steam rise toward the gray sky. This was the first morning in a long time when my thoughts didn't run, didn't brace for impact, didn't rehearse what might go wrong next. Later that week, I drove into town. The truck engine rumbled in a familiar way, steady and patient, like an old friend who knew the roads better than I did. Frost clung to the edges of the windshield until the heater finally won the battle. As I passed the diner, I noticed the same waitress flipping chairs down from the tables. She gave me a small wave. I returned it a quiet greeting between two people who had watched seasons change together without ever needing many words. I stopped by the hardware store for a set of screws. Nothing special. When I walked out, I saw Nathan standing near the parking lot with a cardboard box tucked under his arm. He looked up surprised, then eased a step closer. His face carried a gentleness I hadn't seen when all this began. He spoke with a careful voice. I fixed the kitchen drawer. It kept sticking. "Alyssa said you might appreciate it." I nodded. "Thanks. It's been giving me trouble." His breath fogged in the air as he shifted the box. "I didn't want to wait until Christmas. Evan made something for you." He placed the box in my hands, then stepped back without forcing the moment. I didn't open it there. Instead, I watched him lift his hand in a small wave before he walked to his car. There was no speech, no apology, no plea, just a simple offering. A step forward, modest and real. Back at home, the sun had moved lower, a pale gold sliding across the living room floor. I set the box on the table and sat beside it, letting the moment breathe before lifting the lid. Inside lay the framed knife and the photograph of a younger Nathan perched high on my shoulders. The boy in that picture had his arms stretched wide, as if the world were small, and he could outrun every shadow in it. My hand rested gently on the frame. Not gripping, not clinging. Just touching. The wood felt warm from the sunlight, as if the memory itself still held heat. For a while, I stayed there, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The furnace clicked on the walls, settling lightly, as they always did when winter pressed close. The knife in the frame reminded me of all the things I gave without fanfare. The photograph reminded me of all the things I still wanted to give, even when the path had grown difficult. As afternoon began its slow fade, I stepped outside again. The porch boards creaked under my boots. A thin layer of snow dusted the railing. The sky was a gentle sweep of silver and blue, the kind of sky that promised more cold, but also more light tomorrow. I sat on the top step. My breath drifted into the air, soft and harmless. Birds rustled in the pines across the yard, shaking loose, tiny specks of frost that glimmered as they fell. In the distance, a single car rolled by its tires, whispering over the road. I thought of the year behind me, of the fractures and the mending. There were no perfect answers in any of it. Only choices made one at a time, some painful, some necessary. Justice had not arrived with noise. It had unfolded the way winter breaks into spring, quiet and patient. I remembered Nathan standing in my doorway months earlier, drenched from the storm, holding his son. There was fear in him then, and shame, and something that looked like hope. Today, that same man had handed me a small box without fear, without hesitation. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't atonement. It was a sign that he was trying, step by step, to stand straighter. The wind picked up lightly, brushing against my collar. I closed my eyes and let it pass. When I opened them, the light had shifted again, warmer despite the cold. The town felt peaceful in a way I hadn't noticed in months. I went back inside and placed the framed knife on the shelf above the fireplace. It stood there among the old camping photos and the compass Nathan once tried to fix when he was 10. I let my fingers rest on the shelf one last moment before stepping away. Evening drew in slowly, filling the corners of the house with soft blue. I didn't turn on any lights. I preferred the half-darkness, the kind that lets you feel your way through memory without getting lost. Finally, I settled into the chair by the window. Snow began to fall again, drifting lazily past the glass. Each flake caught the faint glow from the street lamp, turning the air into a quiet dance of pale sparks. I watched them drift and vanish, feeling something loosen inside me, gentle and sure. Out on the road, a truck engine started somewhere far off. The sound rose, then faded into the cold, leaving the world still once more. I let out a slow breath and rested my hand on the arm of the chair. The snow kept falling steady and unhurried, softening everything it touched. In that silence, I felt the weight of the year settle into its proper place, no longer heavy, no longer sharp. Just part of the story. Outside, the light shifted again, catching on the snow, and on the empty porch, and on the road stretching quietly into the dusk. The world kept moving, and so did I.